I am so excited. I almost can't stand it. I absolutely love algebra. This is hands down my favorite chapter out of the whole book. So I'm super excited that it is finally here. Okay. So we are going to start our chapter on algebra. Now, for those of you that maybe aren't as in love with algebra as others, we don't go super deep in this. That is not the whole point of this class. Our goal is not to teach you high level algebra. Our goal is just to introduce enough of it so that you can do well in your future classes. So again, if algebra is not maybe your favorite thing ever, fear not. It's not going to be too deep. Okay. For those of you that love algebra, you're not going to get that much of it. Okay. But here we are. So the good news is we've kind of been introducing the general ideas of algebra throughout this course. We've talked about little bits of algebra quite a bit, actually. So when we were talking about whole numbers, integers, fractions, decimals, we looked at evaluating algebraic expressions. When we were talking about proportions, we did a little tiny bit of solving. When we were dealing with percents, we did the percent equation and the percent proportion. Both involve a little bit of algebra. When we were dealing with goodness, what part? It was something in chapter 7. We were dealing with like the different graphs and finding percentages of different things. We were dealing with a little bit of algebra. So you've seen algebra, little bits of it throughout this course. So hopefully this first section or so won't be too bad. Okay. So the first topic is just understanding algebraic expressions. Okay. So we need to bring back a few definitions. Some of these you have seen. So we're going to go through them again just to make sure everybody's on the same page. Okay. So the first definition is just for that of algebra. So algebra is the branch of mathematics that uses variables in place of numbers. And you can have very simple algebra. You can have fairly complicated, very involved algebra. We're not going to go deep. We're just going to barely scratch the surface, to be honest with you. Okay? Now, the definition for algebra does involve that of a variable. So you're like, okay, so algebra is the branch of math that involves variables. What's that mean? Well, a variable is a letter or symbol that takes the place of some number, so it's some unknown value, okay? We also have a constant, okay? So a constant is a fixed value that does not change. So if I had something like 7x plus 2, well, we clearly have a variable x, but then we have this 2 that's just hanging out by itself. This does not change. Because it does not change, we call it a constant. It is constant. It doesn't change. It stays a 2. Now, this expression right here, the 7x, it's going to change depending on what x is. Okay, so it is not constant. It's going to change depending on how we change x, but the 2 never changes. The 2 just stays a 2. Okay, now we have this definition of a term. So terms are kind of like the building blocks of algebra. Okay, so a term can be a variable, it can be a constant, or it can be the product or quotient of variables and constants. So once you multiply a constant by a variable or divide a constant with a variable, it's no longer a constant, it's a coefficient basically. But just know that you can have a variable by itself, a constant by itself, or you can multiply or divide numbers and variables and you get terms, okay? Now, what's really important to understand about terms, I'm going to do this in a different color. Let's do blue. Terms are separated by addition and subtraction. That's really important. That's how you can tell how many terms you have, is how many plus or minus signs do you have. Okay, now that's not it, because you can have your first sign, which doesn't have a plus or minus sign in front of it, but plus or minuses, they separate all of your terms. Okay, and it doesn't just, that's not all it does. The plus or minus in front of your term also tells you the sign of your term. So if there's a plus sign in front of your term, it's positive. If there's a minus sign in front of your term, it is negative. Okay. Now, the very first term doesn't have a plus or minus in front of it necessarily. So if it has nothing in front of it, it's positive. If it has a negative in front of it, then it would be obviously a negative term. So just know that addition or subtraction that separates your terms, yes, it separates the terms. It also indicates the sign of the term, with the exception of the first sign, the first term rather. You just have to look to see if there's anything in front of it. If nothing's in front of it, positive. If there's a negative in front of it, of course it's negative. Okay? Now, next up, we have a numerical coefficient. So a numerical coefficient is the number factor of a variable term. So if we go back to this example over here, we had 7x plus 2. Well, x was multiplied by 7. So 7 and x are factors. We're looking very specifically for the number factor. We would say 7 is the coefficient. So x is the variable, but the 7, the number factor, that's going to be your numerical coefficient. So it's just basically what you multiply your variables by, okay? And then finally, we have an algebraic expression. A lot of times we'll just call it an expression. You don't necessarily have to describe it as algebraic. We kind of at this point know that's what it's going to be. But an algebraic expression is the combination of numbers, variables, and operation symbols. So when we're talking operation symbols, we're talking plus, minus, multiplication, division. You could also include exponents. And you won't really see it so much at this point, but you could also have square roots. Okay, but for us, mostly it's going to be addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and then exponents. Okay, so we can do not too much with algebraic expressions. For us, we can really just simplify them or evaluate them. So this section is going to be fairly short. Okay, now the first thing we're going to do is just label the different parts. Okay, so we're going to label the different terms. We're going to label their coefficients, their variables, and then whether they're positive or negative kind of comes along with that. Okay, so for example 1, it says label the different parts of each expression. Part A, let's start with just our terms. Let's list out our terms. So the first term is 3x squared. The second term is negative 5xy, and I know it's negative because there's a minus sign in front of it. Now, the 3x squared, I know it's positive because there's nothing in front of it, okay? And then finally, we have 2y squared, and it is also positive because there's a plus sign in front of it, okay? Now, the coefficients, I'm going to try to squeeze it in. So for this first term, I have a coefficient of 3. So the coefficient is the number factor of a variable term. So if you have a term that contains a variable, what is that variable or those variables, what are they being multiplied by? So in this first example, the x squared is multiplied by 3. Okay? In the second term, negative 5xy, the coefficient would be negative 5. The x and the y, the variables, are multiplied by negative 5. And then for the last example, the coefficient would be 2. Okay, so we have the terms, we have the coefficients. Let's talk about the variables. For the first term, I have a variable of x. It happens to be squared, which really just means it's x times x, but the variable alone is just x. For the second term, we have x and y, and for the third term, we have y squared, which is technically y times y, but it's the same variable, so we would just say the variable y. Okay, now as far as constants are concerned, we don't have any. Okay, so that is part A. We've got the terms, their coefficients, and then the variables. And in this case, we have no constants, okay? For part B, we have negative 12a to the third, b to the second, minus a squared b, plus 7ab squared, and then finally minus 9ab. So let's look at the terms. We'll look at the coefficients. We can look at the variables and then constants. Okay, so I'm going to try to list these out like in columns. So we have negative 12a b or a cubed b squared. We have negative ab. Bless my heart. We have negative ab. We have positive 7ab squared, and then we have negative 9ab. And the minus ab should be a squared b, okay? So those are our 4 different terms, okay? We know these are our terms because they're the ones that are separated with addition and subtraction. Now, for the first term, our coefficient, the variables a and b are multiplied by negative 12. The second term looks like it doesn't have a coefficient, so be really careful. If you have variables just by themselves, they still have coefficients. We would just say there's technically a hidden 1 in there. So we would say the coefficient of negative a squared b is negative 1. The coefficient of 7ab squared is 7. And then negative 9ab, the coefficient is negative 9. Now, variables, you can look at the variables for each individual term, or you can just look at the variables for the entire expression. You can see this expression just has a's and b's, and every single term has some combination of a's and b's. So I'm just going to say a's and b's, or just a comma b. Those are our variables. And then constants, again, there's not a number that's all by itself that's not being multiplied by variables. So again, We would just say none. Okay, so make sure you are, whoops, there we go. Make sure you're familiar with these different definitions, especially coefficient term, constant variable, and really expression. When we get into the next chapters, we're going to look at expressions versus equations, so things are going to get a little different then, but make sure you understand these definitions, okay? So in the next videos, we'll look at evaluating algebraic expressions, we'll look at something called the distributive property, and then we'll look at simplifying algebraic expressions as well.